Hello. This week's Parsha Shalach contains the story of the spies. And there's an age-old question with which the Parsha really begins, which was, who was responsible? Who's to blame for what happened? And the difficulty is that in our Parsha it says, Shalach lecho anoshim. God speaks to Moshe and says, send for yourself men, so who will go out and spy the land. Means that Moshe is recorded as the person who would do it under God's instruction. But if you go to Devorim, where Moshe recaps the spy story at the beginning of his valedictory speech, Vatikravun elai kulachem, you all came close to me. Vatomeru, and you said, Nishlach anoshim lefonenu. Let's send out men before us. And he explains what they would do. And having said that, in the next verse, Vayitav be'enai hadovor, and the matter was good in my eyes. God isn't mentioned, and there seems to be a significant discrepancy between the two stories. What does one do with this? There are a number of approaches, but let me focus very briefly on three. The Ibn Ezra is the simplest. He says they're sequential. First of all, there's a conversation when the people come forward, and God authorises it. That's a simple way of reconciling the two accounts. Rashi adopts a more classical midrashic approach, in which he says as follows, it's probably worth reading. I do not approve of this. And Rashi said, God doesn't really approve. Moshe nimlach b'shchina. When they came forward, Moshe consulted with God, Omar, and he said, as it were, Ani omarti lahem shehi tova. God said, I told them the land is good. And he quotes verse to prove this. Chayehem, by their very lives, sha'ani nosein lohem et makom litos, I will give them an opportunity to make a grave error over the matter of the spies, leman lo yoshur, so they will not inherit the land. Meaning, by questioning the land, they demonstrate their unsuitability to go to the land. So according to Rashi, what happens is that the people ask, as in Devorim, God authorises it, but he authorises it on the understanding it's going to be a failure. Do it, but you have to make your own decision. That's how Rashi reads the word lecho. And finally, perhaps a more modern approach, which is advocated by Professor Joshua Berman in his recent book, is that the story is retold from the perspective of a vassal treaty, as it were, replicating the way treaties were made in ancient times, and the narrative is reformed on that basis. I don't know that I find any of these necessarily so compelling, but I have another suggestion. This perhaps is the most traumatic experience of the desert moments. After all, they were going to go to the land. That was the whole point of the exercise. And suddenly they make a terrible mistake and their whole future is imperiled. They think they're going to die in the desert, and most of them will. They're not sure they'll ever see the land, and most of them won't. It's a time of dashed hopes, a terribly harsh outcome, and perhaps also a moment of acute embarrassment about their behaviour, which will be recorded in the Torah and read every year throughout history. The Maharal validates reading this text, and in fact the whole of Devorim, as a retelling of the story from the perspective of the people rather than the God's eye view. And it means that Moshe shifts the narrative, shifts the focus away from God. That's a classic way of retelling a painful story, and a way that makes it easier for the people involved to deal with it. It's actually the basis of something called narrative therapy, in which people are encouraged to create a story, a narrative, whether it's historically factual or not, which enables them to look at history, but recreate it in a story with which they can cope, and enables them not to be stuck in the past, but to move on. I expect, like I have been, that lots of us are following the Black Lives Matter protest across the world, and a lot has been said, written and printed about it. I'd like to add a thought or two. I want to first acknowledge that discrimination against black people in the past and the present is one of the great evils of history, and slavery perhaps the most egregious manifestation of that of all. It is an unimaginable, unerasable trauma. And as a people, the Jewish people, with a very long history of persecution and the victim of prejudice, not that it's a competition, but we should be exquisitely sensitive to the appalling treatment of black people throughout history. And it still goes on in some places. And as we can see, there are people who feel extremely strongly about this, and there is much evidence of terrible wrong. It's quite intolerable, and we would always stand with those who are attempting to eradicate prejudice of any sort, including prejudice against black people. There's a long history of Jewish activism on behalf of black rights. Many Jewish activists were involved and imprisoned in South Africa during the apartheid era. And what is uppermost in my mind is one of my intellectual heroes, Rabbi Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel, in 1965, marched in the Selma March with Martin Luther King. A second point is to validate a discomfort which I feel, and probably many people feel, about the way the protests have gone. That they've been hijacked by extremists on the left who have narratives that are not really in the interest of those who have instigated the protests. They've been hijacked or infiltrated by people on the far right for other purposes. That discomfort is real and worrying, and it makes it very difficult to know exactly how or whether to support certain causes, however important or valid they are as well. And this concern about genuine causes being hijacked by extremists on either side of the political narrative is something we're thinking about a lot in terms of the return to campus and what the political landscape might be like for Jewish students. Thinking a little about the issue of statues, which has been in the news a great deal recently in the past, I think we really should try to understand the anger, the appalling triggering effect of icons of the slave trade. Should we vandalise them, or should we engage in an appropriate process to campaign for their removal, perhaps placing them in a museum, understanding their historical context? I veer towards the latter. But it's also true that none of us lost any sleep when icons of Stalin and other dictators were pulled down, which meant so much to people and triggered, while they were there, such horrible memories of the past. Is it wise to throw icons in a river and perhaps broadcast the name of a slave trader that no one had ever heard of before? I'm not sure. But I do think that we need to be extremely sensitive to why people do this and understanding. It's an understandable, explicable response to trauma. It's a way in which people want to rewrite some of the narratives of the past. And it avoids having to confront painful triggers. But I think activity of this sort risks two things. One is a slippery slope. If we're going to destroy statues of people who were slave traders, of course statues honour people, but we have to make a cautious distinction. Are we also going to pull down the buildings, the public works, the parks, the swimming pools, and all the other contributions that they made to society, notwithstanding where the money came from? Are we going to reject endowments from people whose activities are less than savoury? Do we as a Jewish people, when we see flags and buildings and symbols of nations who historically persecuted us, is that how we should respond? It's certainly not how historically we have responded. And we also risk, by erasing the past, a kind of Orwellian 1984-ish way of looking at the world, in which dates, events and narratives are erased. And I suppose my question is, with all these evils in the past, how can we learn from them if they're not there to learn from? The spies needed to comfort themselves by retelling the story in a way that enabled them to heal and enter the land. Remember, the story in Devarim, which we'll read in a few weeks' time, is just as they stand a few weeks from entering the land, a new generation ready to move on from what happened in the past. It's not for us to tell other communities how to process and how to handle their traumatic past. But perhaps the lesson of the way the spies did retell their story is that there may be ways of retelling the stories that preserve their integrity, which refer to the key points, don't erase them, but enable those who are involved in any way to move on in a healthy way. Good Shabbos and sei gesund und stark.